Hey, everybody, welcome back. I'm Emily Moyer. My beautiful co-host, Danny, is here with me. This is
Don't make me
episode
laugh.
number 75 of Words. And had thought since last time we had a guest, it was such a success, and we haven't had one in a while, that it was time. And so we have a guest today, but I think it's going to go completely differently than the last time we had a guest. And here to chat with us about an aspect of the Ukraine conflict that never even occurred to me, and so I'm assuming most people out there aren't aware of, from the high and mighty Substack page, Vincent Rado. Welcome to Words. We're happy to have you here.
Hey everybody, thanks for having me. I really appreciate y'all giving me the time to talk as well. And I want to say hi to all the viewers and the listeners out there.
Awesome. So Danny sent me, I wouldn't say you send me a ton of videos and articles, Danny, but you send some. But she sent me one several weeks back that I was like, this is kind of how I am when people send me stuff. I'll get to it when I get to it. And when I finally got to it, I was like, oh shit, this one's a fucking real zinger. Like, this guy's like either as big of a crackhead as we are, or has like as much of a bird's eye view as we do. And I'm learning today that maybe it's both. So, so you had this article that connected the sort of expanding psychedelic industrial complex to the conflict in Ukraine. And I was just like, wow, there's like no corner that this shit doesn't touch. So we thought we'd have you here today to tell us about your article. We kind of want to look at the connection between fascism and psychedelics that has been going on for at least 100 and maybe many more hundreds of years. You know, the connection through sort of the lens of your article about this situation. And it inspired me to just go look at something. I went back and read your article again today, and I found something that I was not surprised to find, which is just confirmatory for me on all levels. And so I'll bring it around to that at the end. But to start with, Vince, because you will be new to probably all of our audience, except for maybe Robert Forte. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how you got into it?
Yeah, for sure. So the way that most people know me, and how I kind of got into this topic is I founded a group called DC Psychedelic Society in 2017. And it was not the first of these groups. There were a number that had already popped up across the US and the world, actually. But we were kind of on the earlier side of, there was like a huge wave. Now there's a society that is devoted to psychedelics, like, or a reading club or like what have you. And it seems like every city or almost town, or like especially the college towns. So I got involved in that, and I started a group in DC, and all the organizers of the psychedelic groups are actually, we all kind of know each other, like not personally because we're all scattered all over the world, but the scene of the organizers, of people who actually are willing to put themselves out there and devote their lives to this, is not that big, and we all kind of like know each other. So like very quickly I got connected to some pretty high level people. And like I said, I started the group in 2017. It was March when we began, and by the end of the year we were hosting talks with like Rick Doblin and Dennis McKenna and stuff. So it all moved very fast. And I was down with that, you know, because I was young. I wanted it to move fast. But as I continued to be involved in it, I was just like, whoa, it's kind of weird how fast this is moving. And then I learned there's a lot of money behind this. And then I learned where the money was coming from. And then I was like, oh, this is why it's moving so fast. It's not us grassroots people. There's a bunch of billionaires who are paying for this whole thing on the down low. And that's why there's all the resources and the media coverage and stuff like that. So I still love these drugs. I'm not against drug use, but I did develop a kind of critical perspective toward like whatever you want to call what's going on right now, a movement, the legalization scene, the psychedelic boom. Anyway, all that stuff. So the last couple years I've been like really focusing my attention on kind of like the sides of this that a lot of people either don't want to talk about or just don't know about and aren't talking about. And I only know because I've been so deeply involved in it for, a few years now. And I've met a lot of the advocates and the scientists and whatnot and stuff who are really making the scene happen. And I don't have anything personally against any of these people, but I do think it's important to maintain always a critical thinking perspective. Like we have to exercise our critical thought when we're like seeing all this stuff happen, which I feel like a lot of people aren't. But anyway, that I'm kind of starting to get down a rabbit hole, but that's kind of in a nutshell like my background with psychedelics. I started tripping in high school on acid and ketamine and stuff. Got in a bunch of trouble as a teenager for pot. I wound up um, incarcerated as a teenager, and they actually had me on solitary confinement at the age of 19, only for them to realize it was just a bunch of pot charges and dismiss them and let me go. And that really fucked with me. And that kind of happened like before I started the group, but that was a really impactful experience with me. That kind of like as to personally why did I turn my attention toward all this stuff. So anyway, that's some background. I mean, there's more of course, but I'll keep it brief. So and I do want to move on to the Ukraine stuff. But yeah, I don't know if that helps.
I have a question. I mean, I just want to extend my compassion for, I cannot imagine being in solitary confinement, period, at 19 for something so fucking stupid. I'm going to resist the urge to drill into that. When you dove into like what was pushing the psychedelic movement and you found this like shit ton of money, from your research, is the money pushing this just for greed and profit? Is there a mind control aspect? What have you discovered?
Well, it's very clearly documented that, I mean, the CIA and the military 100% have a long history of uh, interest in these drugs, like literally for mind control. If you actually read the declassified papers from the CIA and stuff, like that is exactly what they were trying to do with these drugs. And it sounds out there to some people, and I understand that because even to me personally, like, okay, so it definitely is the money, and then the mind control thing. I I used to think that that was not significant. Like when I got into the activism, I was aware that the CIA had a history with these drugs, but I didn't think it was that important because that's what the narrative and all the books and all the newspaper articles say. It's like, yeah, the CIA did some stuff, but it wasn't anything really important. And then they stopped and it's in history now. So that's what I believed about it. But as I got more involved in the scene and I realized like so much of the research scene is like it's like joined at the hip with the Department of Defense. And oh yeah, like and I mean what's crazy is like all this information is actually just out there, but like we have all been taught to see these drugs as like the next big thing, and like they're natural, so they're good for us and there's something different from big pharma. But in reality, the whole thing is essentially, I mean, I'm not trying to over generalize here, but this movement is, and I'm talking here, so I'll shut up and turn it back to you. But basically, like this industry is like a marketing pitch for pharma, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are calling the shots, and they're the ones who are going to be making the money. If you look at the boards of the companies that are doing all this research, they're all from huge, big pharma companies. that have anyway. So, and then as for the mind control, yes, and we can get into that. So, and then the other thing that we can talk about is the use of drugs to control people's like perception and behavior from an authoritarian angle actually dates back to for sure ancient Greece and arguably ancient Egypt, also known as Kemet. And I'm happy to break down the history. That's part of what I get into in my new book, is that there's actually a history of the ruling class employing drugs for social order from the beginning. Like this is not anything new. So anyway, that was kind of a long-winded way of answering that very short question, but yeah. So I don't know what we want to get into next. If we want to talk about the Ukraine stuff or
thank you for that, and don't feel free to speak long and a lot. Danny and I are very long-winded, and we're talking all the time. So we definitely get our 2 cents in every way, and we have you here today because we want to hear from you. So don't worry about that. Couple of things. We would love to explore all of the stuff that you were laying down in probably future shows together, and maybe on each of our own podcasts, because we each have different tacks we take with this. You know, Danny has her own history with psychedelics and like her experiences, plus what she thinks is going on based on the social scenes she's been a part of. And my own, probably like my contribution to whatever this is we do here has been like exposure of the lesser known aspects of mind control and MK Ultra and sort of deep black projects, like not the ones everybody knows about, but the ones that those are there because you're allowed to talk about them while there's like way weirder shit going on.
Of course, yeah.
So that has been like probably like the sort of connective thread of all my work, even though I go into like a lot of different topics. So I know we would like to explore all of that, but just because you brought up the topic of are you still living in DC now?
Yes.
DC is one of the first places that is it legalized or just decriminalized?
So depending on who you asked, it's either decriminalized or the technical term that's in the bill is deprioritize.
Okay, so we're talking about not just weed here. We're talking about mushrooms and the natural psychedelics, correct? Is that what we're talking about, or what are we talking about?
Okay, so what these campaigns, so what happened in DC was a decriminalize nature campaign, which for those who have been following, they'll know that these campaigns have been passing all over the US for the last few years. Mm-hmm. But for those that don't know, what these campaigns typically entail is they apply to the plant-based drugs in Schedule 1. And what's interesting is that coca and poppy, I believe, are in Schedule 2. And the decrim nature bills never include coca or poppy, which I have my own issue with, I think. Anyway, but what the campaigns did, what they have done in almost each case in which they've been passed, is they ask the law enforcement in that city or that district or what have you to move the enforcement of the law that prohibits the possession of those drugs to the lowest priority. In other words, the law is still on the books, but they're asking the cops to basically take a hands-off approach, unless if they find someone who's dealing, like hundreds of hits of acid and has pounds of shrooms and is like, then they would still crack down with the charges. And I don't know for a fact, but like how small they will go. But what's interesting is there have already been busts in a lot of the places where these campaigns have passed. So it's important for people to understand that even though they're called decriminalized nature, technically, well, from one perspective, they are, because a loose reading of the word decriminalize means any type of like loosening of the policy or whatever, but a strict reading, and a lot of people argue that it's not a decriminalization because it technically is still a crime. So it's very like nuanced. And I personally, I mean, I understand the politics of why we had to do it that way in DC, because the Congress has control over the budget in DC. And there's a lot of history with that I could get into, but I'll spare you the rabbit hole. But basically, in DC, there are very real reasons why we actually cannot like outright decriminalize Schedule I drugs because of the relationship that the city has with Congress, because it's not a state. But in the other places, I mean, I think this is like a form of incrementalism, and it's interesting because anyway, yeah. So that's like the technical reading of what these bills do. And I served as the community liaison for the DC campaign. In other words, I was like on the ground explaining to people what we're doing. I was talking to voters in DC saying, hey, here's what we want to do, here's why. And because, as I mentioned, the Psych Society that I had started a few years ago, that very much kind of like played it. Like it was in large part like because of all the work I had done through the society, where we were constantly hosting meetings and events and helping to make these drugs more normal. And then that led very naturally into my role in the campaign as like the on the ground guy, one of the on the ground guys. There were a lot of people involved, so I'm not trying to take the credit at all, because there was a huge team involved in.
You gave it grassroots credibility that somebody just coming in fresh out of nowhere would not have been able to have with the people who might have been distrustful of that kind of thing. Okay.
Right.
So,
exactly.
So I was not surprised. So, okay. So now thank you for clarifying the different sort of types of decriminalization and whatnot. I was a little surprised when I heard about this in DC. It did not surprise me, obviously, when it happened in Oakland or Oregon or even too much in Denver. But I was a little surprised for a second in DC. And then pretty quickly, as the mushrooms always do, if you ask the question, they will provide the answer, right? Yeah. And one of the suspicions that I have always had about these substances, and I don't, when I say suspicious, I'm not casting negativity on the substance, right? But that it sort of creates a network. And once you're sort of part of that network, you're always part of the network. And that, you know, Washington, D.C. is one of the places people are the most obsessed with knowing everything that people are doing and who's saying what about who and who knows what information they're either supposed to know or not supposed to know, classified, not classified, top secret, who did this, who did that, who made this deal, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, totally.
And that there's a lot of people around who are not in positions of power, but who are sort of proximate to positions of power that know a lot of things that could get a lot of people in trouble. And creating an open psychic network allows for a type of, let's call it espionage or intelligence gathering that otherwise would not happen. And I know this because it's really weird, but like certain characters show up in my psychedelic space that like it doesn't really make a lot of sense, but they show up there repetitively. And it's like these might be people that I don't know, but I have talked about, or I have some like weird connection up to, but I'm not thinking about them anywhere near when I do mushrooms. But like, why are they there? Like, I feel like they're in the room, right? And so that part of it didn't sort of surprise me. But I've also been playing a lot with this idea of there being things out there, and I don't know if these things are technologies or people or just sort of atmospheric or environmental intelligence that are able to capture intelligence at the level of thought, right? But in order to be able to capture it, you have to sort of be logged on to the same system, and that the mushrooms create in nature the same thing that our internet creates in the digital realm. Any
Yeah.
thoughts on that and why Washington, D.C. may have been interested in that? And then we'll move on to Ukraine and fascist mushroom taking.
Okay, yeah, for sure. Yeah, totally. So I'll keep it brief. So in DC, like there's a lot of drug use. A lot of people use illegal drugs of all sorts. That may come as a surprise to people who would associate it with like all the government types, but turns out even the government types love to get high. And actually, the majority of the DC population is not even it's not even the people that the rest of the country associates with DC, which is like the Congress and all that stuff. They only live in DC half the year. And the actual people who live in DC for real, like we aren't like involved in any of that shit. Like we're just normal people who like, but what's interesting about the DC area is because like you said, it's the people who control the politics of the country operate here, and therefore a lot of what happens here is like either people who are working for them or people who are working for people who are working for them. So there's a lot of layers, right? But all of those layers of DC do drugs. And then as far as why would DC be like an early place to pursue this type of policy? So this gets to the main point really of our conversation, which is that a lot of people get the impression that this wave of interest in these drugs is like a bottom up thing, that like a bunch of hippies did drugs and were like, hey man, this is really cool. And then eventually the scientists found out, and then now the government is finding out. It actually is top down. Like the whole reason this is happening is because DC has been interested in these drugs since World War II. That's when the funding started happening. That's when all the CIA projects began happening. So it's important for people to understand that like this is all happening right now because it already has the approval of the power structures that are based in DC and New York and the West Coast. And yeah, I mean, they're very linked. So, and what we can get into is like, and part of the weirdness of all this is that this type of policy or movement or what have you is like it inherently poses itself as like something opposed to the system or the way things are or like the government. But like the whole process of the legalization of drugs just means, and I'm not arguing against it because I actually think we should legalize all drugs, but we should be aware that that can mean many, many different things. And like, because the US is already an authoritarian like nation, the government and the private sector have combined, which is the definition of fascism, according to the person credited with inventing it, who is Benito Mussolini of the Fascist Party of Italy. So many analysts and journalists and scholars have agreed that the US is a fascist state currently. So while the legalization of drugs could turn out great in many different ideal ways, we live in the reality of like a country where the wealth gap is the highest it's been in like 100 years. The military and the pharmaceutical companies are basically like dictating what the government can spend money on. And all of those factors are totally impacting everything that's happening with the drugs that we refer to as psychedelics now. And I say the drugs that we refer to as because I know that Danny is really into words and language. And a lot of people know that, or some people don't know, but it's more typical knowledge that the word psychedelic was coined by Humphrey Osmond, a psychiatrist who was based out of Canada, in correspondence with Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World and The Doors of Perception. And they were going back and forth in their letters, and they were trying to figure out a good name for these drugs. And that's when Osmond coined this word. But what a lot of people don't know is like, okay, so all those letters actually were published, okay? there's a book out there. I don't know off the top of my head the exact title, so I don't want to misspeak it, but you can pretty easily find it if you Google. There's a book of the letters between Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond in that whole period when they coined this word. And I went back and just read the letters because like everyone talks about, yeah, he coined it with Huxley, yay, cool, but they never go beyond that. It's like, okay, well, like, why did they use that word? Like, what else were they doing when they coined that word? Like, was anyone else, and what's interesting is uh in one of the letter or two prior to the one where he coined this word, what Osmond was talking about is that he had just visited, I want to say it was Merck or Park Davis. Off the top of my head, I forget. It was either Merck or Park Davis, but it was one of these huge pharmaceutical companies where he had just met with them to discuss what is called in the Oaxacan tongue oliliuki, but what we know as the morning glory seeds, which contain lysergamides and all that stuff. So Osmond actually was in discussion with a major pharmaceutical company about the lysergic acids in morning glories. And he was talking about this with Huxley. And then it was in the days and weeks after all this was going on that they coined this word. And then what they also were doing in the same period that a lot of people don't know is that they were talking to John Lilly, who is most often acquainted with ketamines and like dolphins and isolation tanks and stuff. But he was working at the NIMH at the time. And Osmond, he literally writes in his letter, like, I went to see Lilly to talk about brainwashing in his letter to Huxley. So as to your question about like, were they trying to do mind control? They literally are writing in their letters that they're talking about brainwashing. So if you go back and read the letters with a more critical eye, you'll turn out all kinds of weird information. But yeah, I just wanted to say that because like, I use the word in context because that's what people know to refer to this group of drugs as, but I could pick apart for days, like all the different, like, can other drugs be psychedelic? Like, why do we use that word with these drugs? Like, what's the significance of using a word that was coined by a psychiatrist who was in correspondence with the pharmaceutical company? Like, is there other language we can use to talk about these things? Anyway, so that's a whole other thing that I did write about in my last book as well. But yeah, so DC and the psychedelics and stuff. Yeah, I mean, it's the movement for psychedelics is like an outgrowth of DC and the pharmaceutical lobby, basically. But a lot of people don't realize that because it's been like marketed to look like a grassroots thing. And that's a whole other, thing that we can get into. But yeah.
I appreciate your attenuation to language. It warms my heart. And I know we're about to jump into the Ukraine thing, which is really the meat of the matter. But I'm just curious if in your studies you've found a correlation between the push for decriminalization or legalization of psychedelics and social emotional learning, and if you're seeing any sort of plans to connect the two.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think it's really interesting because like oh man,
and if we need to schedule a separate show for just that,
I mean, yeah, and I'll keep it concise because I know I can be long-winded. But so your question is like, is the push for these drugs tied to a desire or an interest in, like you said, social, what was it?
They call it social emotional learning, which I mean, there's a lot of controversy as far as part of the Maoist agenda and capturing young people's minds.
Right. Well, if you actually read the research that was going on, that was done by people like Dr. Jolyon West, who was a top CIA MK Ultra scientist, and a ton of other scientists were working on this kind of stuff. They were exploring how they could use different drugs to bring to the surface various emotional states and then use those to essentially like to manipulate an outcome for the patient. Mm-hmm. And they put it in very technical terms, so it sounds like they're doing a clinical study and blah, blah, blah. But like, if you understand that they were being funded by the CIA and that the same people were also writing papers about how we need to infantilize the new left to make them harmless and like take the tooth out of them, and let's, if they all just go get lost in the woods and do drugs, that's cool with us because they actually are less of a threat that way. And I mean, the Dr. West who I just mentioned, he was literally writing that in, like, there's a quote in his book where I was paraphrasing there, but he says like, if the counterculture people all want to live in a commune and get high all day, like, cool. That just allows us more serious folk to be able to get on with our business. So I don't know. There's just a lot of layers to it. But yeah.
I think that for whatever purpose these substances are used, and I also appreciate the language. Like, it's like, why are we using their terms? Why are we dancing around at their ball? Right.
Yeah.
But for whatever purpose one uses them, and one of the reasons I'm so suspicious of the medicalization and the movement towards decriminalization and legalization is this idea that somebody can tell you what they should be used for, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to just like using them however you see fit, right?
Yeah.
I don't think the purpose of these things is necessarily for healing. We all know that that's something that can happen, but I think that there's many other purposes as well, and they each have their own nature and personality, and I'm sure they wouldn't like to be known that, oh, like, we're just medicine and we're just for this or for whatever, right? It's like you know, pigeonholing someone as being just one thing or whatnot, right? They have their own intelligence. But oh, I just lost my train. Oh, we all, the undoubtable, like, what's undeniable is that, like, when you use them, you become like much more aware of everything around you. You become like sensitized to sort of many other like aspects or versions of what you think of as your normal life, your normal emotional state, your normal space that you reside in, all of that kind of stuff that creates a lot of information. Just the, like, a person trying to understand that experience and then maybe talking about it and whatnot provides, like, you know how they say that data is the new oil or the new gold or whatever, like the amount, like how much more information that generates than just a person talking about their day, right, is something to be considered as well. And that's no matter what you think the purpose is for. If you think the purpose is for healing or mind control or time travel or whatever you think it's for, those states create a lot of sensory information, a lot of verbal information, a lot of conversation, and that's all new mind, like, territory to mine, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So to bounce off that, one thing that's interesting is, like, my major in college was religious studies. So I know, like, I've studied a lot about the history and the structure of all the various, like, churches and whatnot, and I couldn't help but notice that the modern model for how these drugs are being used, which is like, you go and sit in a room with one or two other person, you put on a mask, like, you literally shut your eyes, okay, alone in a room with a figure of authority, and they say that if you're doing it a different way, that you're doing it wrong. And then, like you said, like the point that you just said, like, which is like, when people are on these drugs, okay, so there's a bunch of terms for the idea that you just described. The one that I use is, and have found in the literature, is non-specific amplifier. So they amplify just like whatever is inside you or outside you. It's not fixed from person to person, but like whatever vibes a person is on that day, these drugs tend to just turn it up, all of it. And the different ones have different like nuances, but also, to your point, what you said is almost word for word the scholarly conclusion of a really dope he was like I don't know the full word, it was like a pharmacopsychotherapist therapist, some like one of these really long, but he specialized in the study of the behavior of drugs on people and how we can improve the outcomes for people, basically. And he wrote this great book. But the like one of the main points of the book is that people use drugs on purpose and for their own reasons, which kind of goes to your point, right? But then also it's like when you're talking about who is introducing these drugs and what is the context that we are using them in. To tie it back, the whole reason I mentioned the religious thing is that, to me, I personally kind of see the current model of psychedelic assisted therapy as almost like a secular form of the confession of the church, right? Where like the believer goes in and pours their hearts out and tells all their deepest, darkest stuff to a figure of authority who now it's like you're literally giving. It's just crazy. Like, because from the perspective of the pious person who believes that the church is doing good, it's wonderful. It's a spiritual experience and you're bonding with your I don't know the exact title of the figure who hears the confession, but if you look at it from the outside, it's like, and if you study the history of how the Catholic Church actually like operated, what the confession can be seen as an act of surveillance and of gathering information, and they're putting a spiritual twist on it to make it be almost like your death depends on whether or not you are going to tell me every little thing that you did, like right now. Which, if you look at it structurally, it's very similar to what the CIA would use these drugs to torture and try to get people to confess the truth and stuff. And then, like, to your point, what's going on right now with therapy could be seen as like a mild form of that for the public. And it's like a way to filter out and just see what they can. And the other way that this is all on point is that a lot of the people who are invested in this are like the big tech bros, like the PayPal mafia guys and all these West Coasters from Stanford who run all these big websites that work with the NSA and the DOD, but all, it's anyway. So I agree with what you said. And I definitely think that's a perspective that people should be looking at this from, but we generally aren't.
I think it's funny because you said non-specific amplifier and I wrote in the chat NSA, and then you're talking about like confession basically is a surveillance sham.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's pretty wild. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's cool. All right. So let's go. So Danny sent me this article that you wrote about, psychedelic therapy in newly invaded Ukraine at the time. And just can you kind of explain a little bit about this article to our listeners and sort of how you were led at, like, how did you come up with this?
Okay, yeah. All right. So a big theme of the book I'm working on right now and of my work in general is the intersection of drugs and war. So anytime that there's a war going on, I'm interested in it for political purposes because I want to see a peaceful resolution, but B, I'm interested, how do the drugs like play into this? So as soon as the Ukraine war broke out, I was immediately wondering, I was like, wait, I thought Ukraine was like really corrupt and had all these gangs and stuff. So I was immediately curious, how do the drugs tie into this? And I published a piece on my Substack a while back about the history of illegal drug trafficking in Ukraine that happened after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s. And I was already like researching that and writing about it, which, by the way, like the country has been like literally a pipeline of drugs from Afghanistan into Europe. So like the whole time that the US military was in the Middle East, from like the mid 90s until like literally the end of like now, although the Taliban just banned poppy, but they banned poppy, but the last time they did that, it lasted a few months and then it rebounded and just increased. But anyway, what Ukraine has been for the last 20 or 30 years has been like a transit hub for all the the heroin that was coming out of Afghanistan. So there's already this infrastructure in place with like the corruption that is required for that to happen, you know, like high level, like what's there was a poll maybe like 10 years or so ago that ranked all the countries in Europe by how corrupt they were, and Ukraine was at the top of the list, the most corrupt country in Europe. And that was just a few years ago. But anyway, I was already aware of all this, so then I was just like totally scouring and and devouring anything I saw that had to do with Ukraine and drugs. And um somebody I know pointed out an article that came out in the New Yorker, right? Like hipster intellectual magazine, right? Um and what was wild is like it was a very short article, but what the article, it came out a couple months ago, and it's it was saying like a bunch of people from Ukraine have come to New York to discuss how we can use psychedelic drugs to obtain some kind of beneficial outcome. And like for some of them, it's money. For others, of course, the surface level reason is like the PTSD, all the trauma that this war is already inflicting. And like, that's how they are like pushing it. It's like, just think about all the refugees and all the war veterans from this conflict and how messed up they're going to be, and they're going to need some therapy to. So they're using that as like the ploy to basically test Ukraine as like a new market for these drugs. And what's crazy is that this short article in the New Yorker pretty much just like spelled this out, but they did it in like their cute way. And for people who don't know the background of like war and drugs and mind control and Ukraine and the neo-Nazis, like they didn't say anything about the fact that like, you know, a huge portion of the Ukrainian military is like neo-Nazis. They didn't get into that at all, but they did say, oh, there's a bunch of people from Ukraine and they're meeting with a bunch of people from the US, and we're all gung-ho on like trying to find a way that we can use these drugs in this conflict somehow. And I was just like, I read it and I was like, wow, they're straight up just like, and that's what's crazy about a lot of these things that I feel like you two have talked about in your shows before. Is like, often the information is out there. All you need is literally the critical thinking. That's all that's missing. They often just tell us straight up what they're gonna do, you know? Like they literally announced this in the New Yorker, like, hey, by the way, we're planning on using these drugs to dose a bunch of people in Ukraine, and it's going to be for their trauma, and we're going to make a bunch of money from it. That's the gist of what this article was saying. Now I'm paraphrasing, and the meeting happened in like a hip art studio in Manhattan, and they talked to, and what's wild though is that the artist who hosted this meeting, right? All of their art right now is based on the robots that are being built by DARPA. So DARPA gives this artist, and I wrote a piece about this on my High and Mighty Substack, also on Ukraine. There's a link at the bottom for people who find the piece on Ukraine. If you just go to the bottom, there's a link to all the other stuff I've written about, like Ukraine and drugs and stuff. But there's an artist in New York who she's given these robots by DARPA to make like cool, sexy art with. And then they're hosting this meeting about how to use drugs in Ukraine in this person's art studio. Now, I don't have any problem with these people individually, right? I'm not trying to like beef with these people. This artist, like, good for them, you know? Their art, it actually looks kind of nice. But like, if you look structurally at what's happening, it's like, hold up, they're getting these robots from DARPA. It's like, I wonder what else they're getting from DARPA. You know what I mean? Like, and then the fact that like this artist like literally says, I don't, okay, here, I'm gonna just read the quote because I don't want to misspeak, but it's really important that people, this is the pretext, because I already was writing about all this when I found out about the neo-Nazi stuff that then is what you two saw. So, but this artist, she said, she she said the world has a quote fatigue with the war, meaning the war in Ukraine. Like we're all getting tired of it because it's already been going on for a few months, and it's like we're all so bored of now, right? But she says if we talk about how to use drugs like ayahuasca and stuff, it quote might make it a sexy conversation again. So like she's literally being like, these drugs might make the Ukraine war sexy. It's like, are you serious? And they're literally just printing this in the New Yorker. And it's like, to someone who is just like gobbling all this down and not thinking about it, it's like, okay, cool, yeah, ooh, this is so edgy, drugs, sexy, war, ooh. But it's like, wait a minute, this artist gets robots from DARPA and they're saying that they can use drugs to make war more sexy for the public. Like, woo, this just the whole, it's deep. And then so I was already attuned to all that stuff. And then so what's interesting is that one of the people who attended this meeting that happened in the art studio with the DARPA robots in Manhattan is a delegate from the Ukrainian Psychedelic Research Association. And that's really like one of the main groups that the article that you two saw first it is about. So they, on the surface, it looks like they're not aligned with anybody. It looks like they're just some little activist group in Ukraine that wants to do research and help war veterans and stuff. But if you dig through like what they've been doing, they've done events with maps. So they're clearly in contact with like Rick Doblin. And he spoke at one of their like online like virtual meetings or whatever. And then there's just like there's tons of weird stuff about this group if you actually dig, right? And yeah, okay, so these people right here, Ole Orlov is a psychologist. He's the person on the left. And I don't really know too much about them because they're based in Ukraine and there isn't a ton of info about them, but they're a psychologist that's based in Ukraine. But who's interesting is Elizabeth Ames, who is pictured on
Is this your official publicity photograph?
No.
Okay. Just checking.
I was going to say, because when I think about making drugs and war sexy, that's what I think about.
100%.
Hey, I mean, no harm to any of these people, right? I'm just trying to get this information out there and whatnot. But basically, I really care about all this. So I was like, Elizabeth Ames, like, who is this? Because she's one of the co-founders of what's called UPRA, is like the abbreviation for this group that I'm talking about. So on her LinkedIn, like, and that's what I mean, where it's like all this information is out there. All you got to do is look and turn on your critical thinking skills. That's really all I'm doing. Like, and everyone can do that too. It's not anything that every single person who is listening to this also has the capacity to figure all this stuff out. Because all I'm doing is just absorbing information and processing it. It's not like some hidden shit like that you got to like break a law or leak a document to find this out. This is all just open source on the end. Like, but anyway, I digress. We go to the LinkedIn for Elizabeth Ames, and it turns out that she worked for the US AID, which is well known for its historic ties to the CIA and being kind of like a humanitarian front for the intelligence community in the US to kind of do their business all over the world. And if we look at what she did in the 90s, it turns out that she worked on the Ukrainian mass privatization project for the USAID. If you scroll down a little bit, you'll see it. It's a lot. There's a lot to it. I'm giving you like in a nutshell. There we go. So that's a little screenshot from her LinkedIn. She led Ukraine's first privatization of large state-owned companies and the beginning of Ukraine's capital markets. There it is. Okay. This person co-founded this group that's trying to advocate for MDMA and mushrooms. Now look at what else she did. She was a vice president of a venture capital firm that works with I believe this group works with they get their funding from the US government, but they're a venture capital firm. And she also had a position there that was working on the privatization of the various markets in Ukraine. Okay, so like her career is literally working with the US government to privatize Ukraine. All right. And that information is out there. And then now,
So fascism.
literally
yeah.
fascism. As we said, the merger of state and corporate power. That's literally how Mussolini defined fascism, as a merger of corporate and state power. And we have it like right there.
Wait, hold on one second. Emily, scroll down again, because that job was in Russia.
Isn't that interesting? That was in Moscow after the Soviet Union fell, when everyone thought that communism was gone forever and the US had won history, and Francis Fukuyama was saying, history is over now, we beat the communists, yay. They were like all up in Moscow. I mean, they only left like more recently with all the tensions and stuff. That's why all these companies had to pull out of Moscow when the war started, because the whole, like what the American public and a lot of the people in the government, and I'm not a geopolitical expert, so I don't want to, like, we don't have to get too deep into this, but essentially we thought that whole region of the world was like dibs for our private sector to take over. And everything that's going on now is just a testament to the political tension that has generated. And like everyone thought that communism was gone and the Soviets were done forever, but Putin literally used to work for the KGB in Berlin, and he's running the country now. It's like you're telling me that this person who worked in an intelligence agency in Russia for the Soviet Union. Anyway, it's cute that we fell for it, basically. And now it's like the realpolitik, as they say, is revealing itself. And they're going hyper aggressive with this now, and they're trying to make it cool with the drugs and stuff. But if you literally just look at these people's like resume, I mean, it speaks for itself. The same person, I believe, has a connection to she went to the Harvard Kennedy School, which is
Elizabeth Ames still.
Yes, and you're pulling it up there. But
yeah, Harvard Kennedy School.
Yeah, and I believe she went to the Kennedy School, and then she served as the president on one of their alumni groups. Okay. For people who don't know, the Kennedy School is like, okay, a very highly reputable journalist who has worked with major publications, who is much more well known than I am, who has written books about this stuff, calls the Kennedy School, quote, a training ground for the CIA. He literally wrote a book about it. It's called Spy Schools. There's a picture of it right there. Okay. If you look at the Kennedy School, they have had an agreement with the CIA almost from their inception, if not from their, I mean, I know that the beginning that they were working together at least around the late 70s and going into the 80s, but the Kennedy School was only established like after Kennedy's assassination and stuff. And I just think it's weird because people see the Kennedy School and they're like, oh, it must be super progressive, right? But actually, like, the Kennedy School is like a playground for the intelligence community. And what's crazy is that like the foreign intelligence agencies of other nations actually come to the Kennedy School to spy on what the US is doing. And that's a whole other thing that I've written about that we don't have to get into now, but it's important to understand that like a lot of the people, okay, like if you look at the board of the MAPS, their public benefit corporation, which they have a nonprofit and a public benefit, and this isn't in the article, but I'm just saying for context, there's a bunch of people from MAPS who also went to the Kennedy School. Rick Doblin actually went to the Kennedy School, which is where he learned how to structure MAPS. So MAPS and the intelligence community and the military is like very deeply entangled with the Kennedy School. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the woman who founded this group that's trying to introduce the privatization of psychedelics in Ukraine is a Kennedy School graduate. There's a lot of other people from the same school who have very just oddly powerful positions in this psychedelic field. It's like, it's kind of like you were saying at the beginning, where it's like certain names keep popping up and you're like, why is this person an expert? Like, what do they have to do with it? A lot of them are Kennedy School grads. If you go back and look at where they got their degrees and stuff, a lot of people who are like running the scene right now, not all, but a lot of them came out of the Kennedy School. So that's another important point to understand. But yeah, and then the UPRA, they also have a lot
Hold
of,
on, I have a question about the Kennedy School. So
yeah,
the fact that they called it the Kennedy School, did
yeah.
Kennedy have a different relationship with the intelligence community than we have been led to believe?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, I think, have y'all dug into this a little bit on some of your past shows, or like the whole JFK thing is a huge topic that I am very interested in, but I'll be the first to admit that I'm not like an expert on Kennedy's assassination. But your point is very keen.
Yep.
I thought the same thing. I was like, wait a minute. After this president gets murdered, the Ivy League, who like half the population, I think they have polls where like a third or half of the US believes that the CIA was involved in the assassination of Kennedy. Like, I'm not trying to, I don't know. I wasn't there, but if you look at the data and all that's and the information, to kind of just go form your own conclusion on that. That's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to tell people what to think about Kennedy and his relationship with the, I mean, okay, if you really want to get deep with it, because I know y'all were talking about some other stuff, right? In past shows, JFK worked for the Office of Naval Intelligence at the very beginning of his career. Yes.
I didn't know
Take
that.
notes, everybody, or like write it down. Like,
It down.
so what's interesting about Kennedy is that he was actually like very much a thoroughbred part of the upper class. And part of why he was so much a threat, I mean, it's debatable. Everyone has their own opinion. There's a million different reasons for why Kennedy was killed. And I think to some degree, they're all correct, you know? But again, I'm not an expert, so I don't, and I'm not writing a book about Kennedy's assassination. So I don't want to, I don't know all the sources off the top of my head, like I do with the drug stuff. But I do agree, to wrap it back to the point. I think it's very fascinating that after Kennedy was shot, a school at Harvard, which is where a lot of the people who literally were writing in their correspondence to each other how much they had a distaste for Kennedy and they couldn't wait for him to get out of here. And like a lot of the people connected to the CIA and the Dulleses were like Harvard people and stuff. I also thought it was odd that, you know, oh, it's the Kennedy School. And it fooled me for the first however many times I read it. When I read like Rick Doblin went to the Kennedy School, I was like, oh, cool, Kennedy. And that was like years ago, you know. And then I learned like, wait a minute, the Kennedy School is like a education ground for the CIA, and like a lot of the CIA officers have degrees from the Kennedy School and all this kind of stuff. And then I was like, okay, now I see. And then this gets to, there's like a bigger topic that's going on here, which I will keep very brief right now because I want to get back to the Ukraine thing. But I've noticed that y'all have talked about this in your past shows. So I just wanted to tie it to what we're talking about because it really is all connected, even though that sounds nuts or whatever. But it is like a standard part of the science of government for the government to maintain some degree of control over those in the public who oppose them. And that's what I hinted at the beginning, where this goes back to Egypt. Like, the ruling class has known for a good 4,000 years that, like, if you actually totally eliminate the opposition, it just gets people even more riled up, and there's even more of a threat of a blowback or a revolution or what have you. So and this, I feel like it ties to a lot of what y'all have said, which is, and then I'll wrap it up and we can get back to the Ukraine thing. But like, it's a basic part of political science to give some latitude of expression to the people who are in opposition to the ruling class, because if you totally shut them up entirely, again, as I know I'm kind of just like repeating myself, but if the government totally wipes out the opposition, they know that it will come back even stronger. So what they have learned to do since the time of ancient Egypt, and by they, I'm not saying that there's like like one particular group that has maintained this like the whole time. I'm referring collectively to the upper classes of the most powerful empires in recorded history, because it happened in Egypt, and then the ruling class in Greece learned this from Egypt, then the ruling class in Rome learned it from Greece, then Europe learned it from Rome, then the US learned it from Europe. So it's not one particular group that has been in control the whole time, but this body of knowledge of how to maintain the order by allowing your opposition some degree of freedom so that they don't totally just burn everything down. That's an ancient science that kings and philosophers have been dealing with for like thousands of years. And I say all this to tie in because I feel like, well, this whole Ukraine thing is part of that. Like, the artist said, like, how do we make the war sexy again? It's like, that is part of this, because like war is inherently an imperial project, but they want to make it look like it's something edgy and subversive to support this and to keep dumping money in it, because you know. But anyway, yeah, I'll stop there and to get back to the article and stuff. But yeah.
Two thoughts quickly before we do head back to Ukraine. Has RFK Jr. stated publicly his position on psychedelic assisted therapy, or the connection between the pharmaceutical industrial complex and psychedelics? Has he stated? Has there been any statement from him on this? I can't remember.
To my knowledge, no. And I have watched some interviews because I'm trying to figure him out too. I'm not like, I see why a lot of people like him, but I personally, I just don't trust politicians, period. So it's hard for me to just put my support behind anybody, even if their personal backstory is really appealing to whatever. But as far as, has Kennedy said anything about the psychedelic therapy like recently, I have not heard anything. But one thing that's interesting is like, I don't imagine, it's hard to speak for what he would do, but in my gut, I don't feel like he would be like a threat to the industry. You know, I think if anything, it would continue under his watch. And one little interesting detail that a lot of people may not know that I am including in my new book is that RFK Jr.'s mom, okay, so the original RFK's wife, is said to have used LSD like sometime in the 60s or thereabouts. And some sources claim that she used it either with or through a guy known as Al Hubbard, who has a lot of weird connections, and the people who are like really into the history of these drugs may recognize that name. But there are people with the knowledge of like what was going on at the time who claim that RFK's wife, so RFK Jr.'s mother, used LSD for, and it was presumably beneficial. And there's a lot of other interesting stuff that was going on at the time, which we'll save for another conversation because that's just a whole other thing. But it's interesting to know the backstory there. So like, because his own mom had a beneficial experience with acid, I don't think he's gonna try to really do anything to hold it back. Which, you know, as we said already, I worked for decriminalization, so I myself have worked for the toward the legalization and more access of these drugs. So even if he did support the industry, it's not necessarily a problem. It's like, I'm more interested in like kind of what you touched on is like the relationship between the government and the pharmaceutical industry and the military and all that kind of stuff, because that's really what, if he addresses that, that's where all the psychedelic stuff is coming from.
Well, yeah, I see it. I mean, Danny and I spend a lot of time analyzing, the various scenarios around RFK. And one of the things that has my and our attention is his connection to people who are like, for the idea of like incentivizing homeless people to get off of drugs, or incentivizing people to, you know, do various things, right? And that if psychedelic therapy became part of that, a lot of the people who back these sort of kinds of programs that we're talking about are tech billionaires from Silicon Valley and whatnot. And I could see that becoming part of like the lifting people up, you know, sort of strategy, is including psychedelics, which will also make them more, you know, more moldable and more likely to become, you know, sort of susceptible to the soma of the Brave New World type of thing, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think also with his, you know, recently publicly sworn allegiance to Israel and what we know of Doblin's connection to Mossad, that, you know, I'm filling in a lot of blanks here, but that seems like it would be a coherent partnership. And then I know, and I am gossiping, but from our mutual friend Robert, that when they were all at a dinner party together, that RFK was like really excited to talk to Robert about how much psychedelics had helped his whole family and how much he loves psychedelics.
Yep.
And Muji pens are the best.
I forgot about that, but you're like, now that you mention it, oh, hey, yeah, they're awesome. Yeah, I thought you said that was what RFK said. I was like, RFK likes Muji. Anyway, no, I got you. Yeah, they are great. Yeah, and like now that you mention that, it does ring a bell. And yeah, I mean, it kind of fits in with, you know, I mean, yeah, because his mother had a beneficial experience. And the whole connection with Israel is just, that is a whole conversation itself. You know what I mean? Like here we are talking about Ukraine. Oh man, if we want to talk about Israel, that's, you know, there's a lot there. And
we'll save that one for another day, because that's a whole own series, maybe not even a show. The other thing I was going to say about you talking about making the war sexy, I read this blog article, like through certain topics that I'm very focused on, like have this ongoing obsession with the lyrics of the songs of the group Blondie, right? And Deborah Harry seems to, like, almost all of their songs in some way refer to nuclear power or the atomic bomb or something about sort of genetics or things under your skin. Like it seems very much like, you know, there's some reference, it's like her music is steganography for hiding information that is sort of intelligence based, but that people think that it's a pop song or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
She was very involved in the early sort of punk pop scene in New York at CD and all that kind of stuff. There was this blog post of somebody analyzing her song called Atomic, which is a song that for a period of my life I got very obsessed with, and I can't really tell you why, because there's like almost nothing to it. But this blog post was talking about this song as like an ode to like getting over all the fears and the, you know, very like logical concerns about nuclear war, and just sort of like dazzling in the glamour of not caring about it type of thing, right? Yeah. And it was a really interesting blog post, and it makes me think of what you're talking about with this artist. Like, I think Deborah Harry was to punk pop music what this artist is to the art scene in New York. And
I just got confirmation chills. Just want to acknowledge that.
The connection between you know, like really supposedly counterculture, but that, and then the defense intelligence and military industrial complex and corporations and the people involved, like this artist and like Deborah Harry, like they may be just doing them. They may not be ill-intended, but something, lots of ones and lots of things have figured out that this is the perfect vessel for us to channel energy through to get people to buy into this and think that they're opposing it and think that it's somehow like counter or whatnot. I'll have to look at the artists that you're talking about and see sort of what else I can pull up connection wise.
Yeah.
But if you look at many of the things that have been like Deborah Harry and Blondie was really important culturally with music because of how many different styles of music they did, how they brought rap
Right.
and reggae and disco and pop and all kinds of shit. There was something for everybody, but nothing was left untouched by that influence. And, you know, if you can get people whistling songs that are intentionally about like the atomic bomb and war and whatever, right? That's a form of tacit consent that people don't even really think about. Right? In addition to like, these are all things that we don't really understand the implications of. Sure, we understand like what a bomb does to a city or what being exposed to nuclear radiation does to someone when they have cancer. Both of these things do lots of other stuff too that we know nothing about. And so whether you think war is sexy or war is terrifying, if you only think about it in the terms that are like laid out in front of you, you have no idea what's going on.
Also, I just want to say, like, I appreciate the compassion, Emily, in like letting the artists off the hook, but I'm sorry, wouldn't you wonder why DARPA is donating things to you? Like that's a big pile of denial or a huge chasm to skip over if you're not questioning that as an artist.
Okay, well, a lot of artists who like they don't like it. They don't like they may not. They just want to do their art, and whatever allows them to do their art, even if it's a not ideal situation or even a compromising situation, they want to do their art. So
that's fine, but then they're complicit. But then they're complicit.
I agree with both of you, right? Because everyone is going to have their own individual perspective, and I think most artists who play this role, I think a lot of them, and I also was raised in the music industry and have a lot of connections there. My music has been played on the DC public radio and stuff. Like I heard you did an interview about the Pacifica Foundation and stuff. Anyway, so I have a lot of thoughts about the music industry, but that's going to be a whole other thing. I just want to say real quick, there are two things to connect it. Because I mean, yes, the artists and the musicians and the activists who spread these messages, they are both ignorant, and also they're still not like, we should still hold them accountable, because specifically what allows them to play these roles is the fact that they either choose to be ignorant or they choose to ally themselves with the power structure. And I don't want to make it an either or fallacy, because often it's like a blend of both, and there's all types of other factors and stuff. But as to your point about the music industry, the military industrial complex and stuff, I think you'll dig this, right? Do you know anything about the lead singer of Blink 182?
I do not.
The whole thing with the UFO stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
He has it's called an academy. I don't know. I guess
the Stars Academy.
The Stars Academy, where he started it with a dude who worked at the CIA for decades, at the headquarters of CIA, who is retired or whatever, and now he worked with the lead singer from Blink 182 to co-found this group where they basically have these courses where they teach people that like maybe aliens are real, and like maybe we actually are already in touch with aliens. And it's like, the alien thing is a whole other thing. In general, I don't totally believe or totally disbelieve anything, because I acknowledge that the individual perception is always limited, and that one brain can never process all the information that will be necessary to totally understand something. So I'm not ever going to claim that I know what's going on with the aliens or whatever, but I think it's interesting. I mean, for the nerds who are really into this stuff out there will already know that the background with the military and the aliens is like some heavy stuff. And the fact that they got a pop singer who's now doing like this project where they're pushing the alien theories with a CIA top dog guy. And then what else is interesting is the same guy, I forget what these pop stars and the celebrities and stuff, I don't save the space in my brain cells to remember their name. So I don't even know off the top of my head what the name of the Blink 182 guy is. But at some point he started to brandish the Freemason symbol on all of his jackets and his guitars. And like, if he's asked about it, he'll be like, I can't really talk about that. Like, if people ask him, are you a Freemason? He'll be like, I don't really want to talk about that. But that's exactly what most Freemasons say, because to be a Freemason, you have to take an oath not to tell anyone else who's not a Mason about what you do.
Well, and it's also so rude. It's like me showing up for an interview with this on my head and you guys asking what's on your head and me saying, I can't talk about it.
Right. Well, and that's part of the whole, that's part of the mystique. So it kind of goes back to what Emily said about like the use of information and how to sway the momentum of what is publicly available so that it's in favor of the ruling class, basically. So what the Masons do, and this also goes back to Egypt. So the Freemasons is a perfect example of how these types of techniques for social control that have been going on since ancient Egypt or Kemet and have been taught. And like, if you read the high level Freemason writers, the few books that are actually public, that they actually have out there that we can actually access, they openly profess that the Freemasons are trying to recreate the Egyptian mystery cults. Like, that is straight up their whole thing. And like, and this is kind of, we may just have to save this for another talk, which is totally cool. But like, this whole topic of like the use of mystery and access like to knowledge, that's exactly like at the crux of this whole, everything that we've been talking about. So it does all tie together. The Blink-182 thing is weird. I mean, it's a clear example of like a rock star who's working with a former CIA dude to push some alien stuff. And it's like, however you feel about aliens is cool. I'm not trying to, I don't even know, you know, it's not up to me to tell people how to think about that, but I think it's interesting that all this is going on. And then the other thing I think, I don't know if y'all are aware of this, but I feel like it's going to connect some dots, right? Because like what Danny was saying about how like these artists, like we shouldn't let them off the hook. What's interesting is like,
correct.
So what's interesting is often the imperial forces, the forces of the intelligence community will present themselves to people in a way where they don't actually know. So if Blondie, and I'm saying hypothetically, right? Because I know Blondie's music. I'm very well aware with punk. I've been to CBGBs and all that stuff. I have no idea if Blondie was being handled, right? But if she was, I highly doubt that she would even really be aware of what was going on. That's the whole art of that. And if you read, like, Alan Dulles has written books about this. It goes back to The Art of War by Sun Tzu from like the BC. But the particular thing that I think is going to connect some dots is in the 60s, we know for a fact that the CIA was using a front company to fund exhibitions of abstract art.
Yes.
We've talked about that.
Yeah.
Yes. And it was specifically as an alternative to what's called social realism, which is another school of art that was very big at the time, especially in Europe, which, as its name implies, is about real things that happened that affect our society. So it's often like paintings of important historical events or leaders of like social and political movements. It's like art about stuff that like matters. It's not just like a bunch of colors on a canvas that like look pretty. It's like the paintings are meant to convey information about history, about society. And there's been books written about this. I think one is called I forget the name of the book off the top of my head, but it's written by a woman named Frances Saunders, and it's called it has something to do with like the Cold War and art. She wrote a whole book exploring the program that the CIA had to fund the abstract artists, like not only in the US, but also like to fund the American artists in Europe, to promote that people would associate abstract art with like yes. So she wrote an amazing book. It's probably on there. I forget what it was called. It's about like the Cold War.
Modern art was a CIA weapon. Yeah, I'm familiar with this idea, but I don't know a lot about her. Right? Well,
she has the one who brought
Piper. If you go down to her books,
right there you go.
Yeah, Who Paid the Piper? There's another one. I forget the anyway, but you can go to her research to learn more about this. This is documented, and like, so we know for a fact that this was going on in the 60s, and like, but this really wasn't public information until, you know, like she's writing what, like in like the late 80s, the 90s, like the Who Paid the Piper was the late 90s.
Emily,
So
will
it's
you
like,
scroll down to the bottom of the page? It'll give us the dates next to her books. See?
1999.
The Cultural Cold War. Okay, that's the title that I know. Who Paid the Piper? Okay, yeah, the Cultural Cold War is the book I would recommend, that gets into all the stuff about art and stuff. But and then there's other books that have been written about the connections between like the music industry and the military and all this kind of stuff.
Dave
But
McGowan, yeah.
yeah, it's a huge topic. Yeah, I think there's a lot to it, and I'm glad that you brought it up. Yeah.
All right, let's do this. I have to pee and I can't hold it anymore and I want to concentrate. And we've been going a long time. Let's just like pause for a second, take a quick break, and then come back and get back and just dig out the Ukraine scenario. And like definitely would love to have all of these other conversations. All right, we're gonna take a quick pause here.
Okay, I'm gonna go pee too.